The Thames River was flowing, and the wind was blowing through the trees, just the same as it always had in the city of New London, Connecticut. One thing that was not the same was Susette Kilo's view. Just a few days prior, Kilo looked out the window of her little pink house and watched the river flow by. Now, she watched the river flow from an empty lot where her beloved home once existed. Kilo never thought the little 100-year-old cottage she purchased and repaired in 1997 would be relocated from its picturesque site overlooking the river to a location whose only view was other homes. Kilo and her fellow neighbors, the Dearys, loved their land and did not want to let it go. Pfizer, the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical giant, had agreed to build their brand new headquarters on land belonging to 90 families in the Fort Trumbull neighborhood. In 2000, the New London City Council authorized the use of eminent domain to seize the land of those who refused to sell. 7 residents, including Susette Kilo, refused to sell to Pfizer despite the company's intense daily harassment. Kilo and her neighbors sought the help of attorneys and were advised that the chances of winning were slim. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of the city of New London. Kilo and her neighbors lost the court case and their homes. The proposed project was never completed. The land remains vacant to this day. All that the Kilos, the Dearys, and the other families had suffered ended up being in vain. Eminent domain is the government's power to forcibly take private property for public use. This power is an inherent power of government, known as the despotic power, and is not explicitly granted to the government in the Constitution. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, is the framework of the freedoms that belong to the American people. The Fifth Amendment contains the Takings Clause, which limits the exercise of eminent domain by the government by stating, quote, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation," end quote. Traditional public uses includes roads, bridges, schools, and other projects that are owned by the public and controlled by the government. The term public use was later expanded to include urban renewal through the removal and replacement of areas determined to be blighted or damaged. The Supreme Court ruling in the Kilo case further expanded the meaning of public use to include economic development by private parties. The justification for using eminent domain in these cases is that increased tax revenue or the creation of jobs will serve the public good. Eminent domain laws vary from state to state. After the Kilo case, 42 states passed laws restricting the use of eminent domain for private development. In all states, however, eminent domain can still be used to acquired land declared as blighted, and in most instances, the definition of blight is undefined. This leaves open a backdoor through which local governments continue to use eminent domain for private development. The process of eminent domain is as follows. The local government identifies the property they want to have and make the owner a purchase offer. If the offer is accepted, payment is made and the property deed is released. If the offer is declined, an appraiser establishes fair market value, which the owner can accept or reject. If the owner refuses to sell the property, the local government files a court action to seize the property. If the government wins, the owner is paid fair market value and evicted. The exercise of eminent domain is rampant. No national database collecting numbers regarding eminent domain seizures exists, but research yielded that in 2018, there were 21,613 cases in Texas alone where property owners reported to the comptroller's office that their land was being threatened by eminent domain. This thesis is not an argument against the use of eminent domain for primary public use purposes, as previously mentioned, or for secondary purposes, such as economic development by private parties. My argument will focus on the meaning of just compensation. The Takings Clause requires just compensation without defining the term. Just compensation is assumed to be fair market value by those who wish to acquire land by means of eminent domain. Fair market value, however, requires both a willing buyer and a willing seller. When eminent domain is used, the property owner is not a willing seller. Therefore, fair market value should not be the basis for just compensation. My argument is that without just compensation, eminent domain does not meet the requirements of the Takings Clause and is unconstitutional. It is my intent to argue for a different basis for just compensation. With the new definition, exercising eminent domain will be constitutional. A precedent for this concept exists, as 6 states have amended their definition of just compensation to include emotional values, which are added to fair market value to redefine just compensation. These values are up to 25% for homesteads and up to 50% for other property under special circumstances. I propose the remaining states be required to redefine just compensation to include a minimum emotional value of 25% added to fair market value for primary residences or homesteads seized by eminent domain. Private property other than homesteads would receive an additional value to be determined by each state. Just compensation must be redefined because first, in cases where eminent domain is used for private development, impoverished families who lack the financial and political resources to fight for their property are being taken advantage of and struggle to find comparable replacement housing. Second, just compensation must be redefined because traditional fair market value alone is not just compensation unless emotional factors are considered in the property value. Lastly, just compensation must be redefined because it will discourage local governments from using fraudulent means to seize land for speculative purposes. Just compensation must be redefined because the families being displaced do not have the financial means or political connections to fight for their property and resist being taken advantage of. The homes, businesses, and properties most at risk of being seized by eminent domain are generally lower in value and more likely to be owned by those with a lower income than average. Most of the time, these are minorities who are underprivileged in regards to education, income, and social status. The Institute for Justice, the IJ, a national law firm who litigates to limit the size and scope of government power, conducted a research of census data from the early 2000s. They found that in project areas where eminent domain was threatened or used for private development, 58% of the population consisted of minorities, compared to only 45% in the surrounding communities. Of these, 25% live at or below the poverty level, with a median income of less than $19,000 per year. An example of this occurred in 2006 in El Paso, Texas, where eminent domain was proposed to redevelop more than 100 acres of the downtown area. The affected population was almost 100% minority. 56% lived at or below the poverty level, and 80% had less than a high school diploma. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the amount of money needed for a family of four to attain a moderate yet adequate standard of living in El Paso is $66,634 per year. This is 3.5 times more than the average median income of families affected by eminent domain. There is little chances that families like this have the financial means or political connections to fight for their property. The displaced families are taken advantage of, as the compensation received is often not sufficient to allow them to find comparable replacement housing. In 2006, Matthew J. Parlow, the dean of Chapman University School of Law, conducted a study of the effects of eminent domain on affordable housing for low-income families. He found that such housing was in short supply in many urban areas. Even though the demand for affordable housing is high and continues to grow, these areas are typically targeted by eminent domain for private development. In his study, Parlow states, quote, "Not only do cities fail to use their eminent domain powers to build more affordable housing units, but they often use their powers to bulldoze them," end quote. Cities frequently use eminent domain powers to improve their profile or reputation by drawing a major employer to the area or by building a new sports facility to enhance the city's image. In his same study, Parlow later states, quote, "This trend has decreased the opportunity to create affordable housing units because such projects tend not to create sales tax revenue, and they do not maximize the potential property taxes that can be generated from a new development," end quote. This reduces the supply of affordable housing and displaces the residents of the seized properties, which creates a higher demand on the remaining supply of affordable homes. This increases the cost of what used to be affordable housing, which makes it more difficult to find comparable housing. Just compensation must be redefined to protect the poor from being abused by private entities that acquire their land through eminent domain. This additional value will help the displaced families find affordable housing in a new location comparable to their former housing. The second reason why just compensation must be redefined is because it is the basis upon which eminent domain is justified in the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment and should have emotional factors. Research found that the losses suffered by an owner whose land was taken by eminent domain included both economic and emotional losses. Emotional factors include generational ties, family memories, and community. Additionally, researchers found that the poor who are displaced by eminent domain not only suffer monetarily, but also psychologically and physically. A study conducted by sociologist Herbert Gans found that 46% of women and 38% of men suffered fairly severe grief following eminent domain seizures in Boston's West End. Furthermore, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas discussed research that found that people experience negative health and emotional reactions as a result of losing friends, neighbors, and churches when displaced by eminent domain. Justice Thomas states, quote, "No compensation is possible for the subjected value of these lands to the individuals displaced and the indignity inflicted by uprooting them from their homes," end quote. I agree with Justice Thomas that no compensation can completely satisfy the loss of a home. However, it is better to receive additional compensation than none at all. It is recognized that no mathematical formula will be able to accurately assign a dollar value for all of the emotional factors which an owner may have with their property, but it is a step in the right direction. In 2006, Missouri amended its eminent domain laws to include a 25% homestead value and a 50% heritage value. These values are a percentage of fair market value and are added to fair market value to redefine just compensation. The homestead value is for any primary residence or homestead seized by eminent domain. The heritage value is for any private property or business owned by the same family for 50 years or more. Michigan, Iowa, Indiana, Connecticut, and Rhode Island have created similar provisions in their eminent domain laws. Other state governments may be reluctant to voluntarily pass legislation that would increase the cost of eminent domain. For that reason, a challenge to the courts to redefine just compensation is the most likely avenue that this proposal would have to become law. This thesis proposes that each state be required to establish a minimum homestead value of 25% and a heritage value to be determined by each state. This will ensure that the compensation being paid in eminent domain cases is truly just, as required by the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. The third reason why just compensation must be redefined is to help prevent frivolous and fraudulent eminent domain takings for private development projects. Boy, you talk about a tongue twister, huh? There are documented cases where local governments took homes and businesses with no private development project identified, or without any commitment from a developer to follow through and complete a defined project. Our government is willing to displace residents and businesses in order to roll the dice, hoping to attract a project that will create a higher value for the land. In order to make the acquired land as attractive as possible to potential developers, local governments use fraudulent means to lower the fair market value. The most common way is by allowing condemnations to continue under the guise of removing blight. The vast majority of states define blight so broadly that almost any neighborhood can be declared blighted and therefore can be seized through eminent domain. For example, in 2002, the city of San Jose, California, declared a third of its area as blighted to create a huge redevelopment zone. One neighborhood of single-family homes was declared blighted due to wet leaves on a tennis court and visible garbage cans sitting on the curb. When land is taken for private development, an argument is made by the government that the seizure is for public use and promises public benefits, generally in the form of increased property tax revenues or job creation. No private development project is guaranteed to succeed, including those that rely on the use of eminent domain. However, when projects that use eminent domain fail, the loss is far worse than if the city didn't pursue the project through eminent domain in the first place. In the Kelo case, Pfizer never built the planned development, and the once stable neighborhood remains vacant. In Mesa, Arizona, the city condemned 30 acres of land and 63 homes only to have the land sit vacant when a developer couldn't arrange financing. In the Detroit suburb of Poletown, the city paid $200 million to seize an entire neighborhood of residents and businesses GM only paid the city $8 million for the property to build a new automobile plant. The mayor and GM promised 6,000 jobs, but they only employed 2,500 jobs. An economic analyst determined that the destruction of the neighborhood resulted in a net loss of jobs. On the other hand, there are examples of economic development and renewal that occurred without the use of eminent domain. This was done by allowing market forces to work. It involves rezoning, easing of permit requirements, and other administrative factors. The key component, however, is requiring a developer to purchase private property from an owner without the threat of eminent domain. Since this involves both a willing buyer and a willing seller, it drives the purchase price of the property towards a true market price and is more representative of just compensation. The Platinum Triangle project in Anaheim, California, and the revitalization of Times Square in New York City are both examples. Additionally, 42 states passed laws restricting the use of eminent domain for private development following the Kelo decision, including limitations on urban blight designations. This led some government officials to declare that these restrictions would result in a reduction of development projects and the associated economic growth. However, a study done by the Institute for Justice found that eminent domain reform did not reduce economic growth, even in the states that had the strongest restrictions. Economic development can be and has been successfully accomplished without the use of eminent domain. In a perfect world, just compensation would be driven by market forces, the price at which real property would change hands in a voluntary transaction between a willing buyer and a willing seller, and fair market value would truly be just compensation. This would eliminate the need for eminent domain exercises altogether. However, many government agencies don't want to give up the power that would be required to allow market forces to work without the use of eminent domain. Therefore, just compensation must be redefined to help eliminate fraudulent blight designations, property valuations, and prevent frivolous exercises of eminent domain. Some have expressed concerns about the increased cost of the projects, which would be affected by adding the proposed values. Redefining just compensation as proposed would increase the acquisition cost of land for projects seized by eminent domain. If these projects are true public benefits, such as a highway, hospital, or school, for example, then they are not for-profit projects, and the cost of the land would have no impact on whether the project succeeded or not. On the other hand, private development projects are for-profit. The cost of the land will affect the project's economics. Research indicates that the additional costs associated with these values has not reduced economic development. Many private development projects promise an increase in tax revenues as well as job creation. The problem with this is that even though jobs may be created due to eminent domain seizures, there is no guarantee whatsoever that the displaced property owners or the surrounding areas would be offered those jobs. For example, if the development that was planned to bring in jobs required skilled workers, but the displaced property owners in the affected areas did not have those skills, then they wouldn't be able to work at the plant. Sisette Kelo is her name, and the government forced her from her home. People are forced from their homes daily and are being paid significantly less than they would accept as a willing seller. Few took notice of the families who were stripped of their homes until Sisette Kelo took her case to the Supreme Court in 2005. The Supreme Court ruled that seizing private property from one party and transferring it to another party for economic development was constitutional. How would you feel if it was your home being seized for private economic gain? Unfortunately for Kelo and her neighbors, the condemned land remains empty. The only thing that occupies the land are feral cats. Out of all the developments from Pfizer, the only development produced so far are improvised cat shelters, constructed by the neighborhood residents. Adjusting fair market value as proposed would have increased the cost of the project and may have caused Pfizer to be a little more diligent before seizing land for its own purposes. With my proposal, Sisette Kelo could very well still be living in her little pink house overlooking the Thames River. Thank you.
All right, on Caleb's panel, we have Stephanie Jew. Oh, one second. We have Stephanie Jew, who is an assistant director of the Energy Management Program at the University of Texas at Austin, and is a lecturer in business law and ethics in the McCombs School of Business. She's been teaching at the university level for 10 years. She has industry experience as a legal analyst for ExxonMobil Corporation and as associate corporal counsel for the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. We also have Sonny Allen, who has over 38 years of real estate experience. He obtained his real estate license in 1981 and became a broker in '85. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Sam Houston State University with an agriculture business major and minor in real estate. He has an extensive range of real estate experience, including ranch brokerage, agricultural land valuation, commercial appraisal, and real estate finance. In 2009, Sonny founded West Pole Partners, LLC, which specializes in ranch brokerage and consulting for wildlife and agriculture-related properties. We also have Christy Wilson, who was Caleb's advisor, and she's probably one of the funniest people I know, but not quite as funny as her husband. That's going to stick in her craw for days, I guarantee you. We also have Mr. Donaldson, who also is not as funny as Christy's husband. All right. In front of you, you have a paddle. If you show me the white side of that paddle, it means you have a new question. If you show me the red, it means you have follow-up, and you get priority. So the floor is open.
Caleb, I think you're funnier than my husband.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Okay, so you started your thesis, very good job, by the way. You started your thesis telling us about the little pink house, and you ended your thesis telling us a little bit about the pink house, tongue twister. Could you talk more about, you said that under your proposal, Suzette Kilo could have stayed there. Could you flesh that out and give me some details about how it would have looked differently under your proposal?
Yes, ma'am. I just want to clarify something, just in case it wasn't clear. Her home was not destroyed like the other homes in the neighborhood. The other 89 homes were. Her home was relocated because Pfizer was under so much heat already from the lawsuit that they didn't want to make matters worse. But to answer your question, so with my proposal, this is adding an additional value. In her case, it would have been 25% onto her current fair market value. This alone would have caused Pfizer to spend more money and would have already caused them to be a little more careful before throwing money on the table. But her home wasn't the only home being seized. There were 89 other homes as well. So if you take the fair market value for 90 homes, and then you put my proposal on top of it, 25% for those other 90 homes, that suddenly takes the costs of the project up so much more. That new amount of money would have caused Pfizer to be a lot more diligent and weigh the pros and cons of whether they wanted to seize that land or not before just throwing money on the table and seizing it.
So I get the logic behind the 25%, but when we're talking about $100 million factory, for example, and you said that a lot of these homes are in poor neighborhoods whose home values will be 100,000, 200,000. 25%, even for 89 homes, is not a significant. I don't know. I have doubts that the 25% alone is going to cause a multi-billion-dollar corporation to, put a screeching halt to a large development project. So what's sort of the reaction to that hesitation?
Well, you may say it's 84 homes, but regardless, people are still being not only affected monetarily, but remember, they're being affected psychologically and physically. So is it right to say, we don't really care about the money as much or your well-being? You still have to take in fact the other factors that go into seizing one's home. I really do think that this additional value will keep these companies from just willy-nilly throwing money on the table. And, I propose a minimum emotional value of 25%. If Texas wanted to, they could create 34% or 30%. I just wanted to kind of follow suit with Missouri since they were the first state to come up with this idea. But I really do think that it would have an effect.
Sorry, we got a follow-up over here, if that's okay.
Oh.
Sonny, go ahead, and then we'll go over.
So the bulk of your thesis was referring to eminent domain for the purpose of private company development.
Yes, sir.
Yet you briefly touched on eminent domain for public benefits such as roads and hospitals, et cetera. I wanted to understand, do you feel like that the just compensation definition you're proposing should be the same in both cases?
Yes, sir, I do. I think that it should be the same for true public uses, but as well as economic development by private parties. Regardless of the fact someone is losing their home, and odds are they're being paid significantly less than they deserve. And so whether it is for a public use or not, they are still losing their home, and they are still being negatively affected monetarily, psychologically, and physically. And so my proposal would stretch to both ends for public use and for economic development.
Go ahead.
This is not a follow-up, it's another question. On going with the just compensation claim that you're making, is there any consideration for neighboring properties that aren't being seized or aren't having the eminent domain directly impact them, but yet they're economically impacted? Or I guess I can give you an example. Say there's a transmission power line being put in down the neighboring property, and it affects your value because now nobody's going to pay as much for your property because they don't want to be next to the transmission line.
Right.
Where do you stand on that?
So I didn't run into any numbers in my research that showed how those other properties or families were affected. If I were to guess, I would say that it would affect them and that most people wouldn't be too hyped up about having that project right on their land. But just so I make sure I'm understanding your question, is how would the neighbors of the land that's being taken be affected?
Correct.
So, yes, sir, if I were to guess, I certainly wouldn't be very thrilled about a project like that being put right next to my home, but in my research, I didn't find any numbers that kind of incorporated that idea.
Stephanie?
So since you're calling the 25%, I guess it's a premium that would be paid is kind of like for emotional value, would it make more sense instead of just paying more money to provide those things that they're losing, like job training and relocation and moving expenses? Or is it just the 25% is just efficient, it's easy, write a check? But to me, it seems like it makes more sense that if our concern is with the fact that these people are being emotionally traumatized, maybe the private companies should cover those other types of things to kind of compensate in that way.
Yes, ma'am. So I did find a little bit of research in that area. So about 10 years ago when Jerry World Stadium, or Cowboy Stadium, was, the idea to build it was kind of proposed, the private developers came into the families whose homes were going to have to be taken and seized, and they said, this is our idea, this is what we plan to do. They offered them what they truly believed was fair market value, and they said that if they accepted their offer, they would pay their moving expenses up to 50 miles away. They would also pay them $22,000 on top of their fair market value. But the threat of eminent domain was still there, because if they declined that offer, their land was going to be taken away anyways, and they wouldn't have, And so I did see a little bit of research in that area, but I still think that this additional value would be more beneficial. It would be nice somewhere in the future if this proposal does become law that moving expenses would be added on top of it. That would definitely, I guess, sweeten the deal. I mean, I know that they're still losing a home and everything like that, but it may help them accept the fact and gain more money out of the deal.
Caleb, just as a follow-up to that, so if a 25% premium is put on top of the land that is taken for eminent domain, any concern that now you've created an industry of speculators, people who are going to say, okay, let's look at the city and see where we think maybe Austin wants to put a new airport, or where Pfizer's going to put a new factory, and we're going to buy up the land there because we at least know we're going to get fair market value plus 25%. Was there any concern that by fixing a sweetener to land that you're going to create sort of like a gold rush to buy up this land from investors?
Yes, sir. So I did think about that. And so these people can try to rush this land if they want to, and they are more than welcome to offer that homeowner what they think is true fair market value. But regardless of the fact, that homeowner doesn't have to sell their property. If they truly think eminent domain is going to be, applied and, in a public use is going to be brought in, and they think they can get the 25% value, great for them. They can try all they would like to, but that the homeowner who's currently there doesn't have to accept their offer. And so, yes, sir, I have thought about it, and that was kind of my thoughts on the subject.
In the 25%, did you factor in kind of maybe the tax implications? Because the IRS would see that as income. So is that including what they might have to pay in income taxes because they're getting this extra money?
Right. I did not really include that in my proposal when I was thinking about the 25%, but it is definitely something that should be noted in that, and it's thought-provoking and something I would look into when going further along with this proposal.
So part of the beginning of your thesis mentioned that sort of just compensation is a hard thing to define. Sort of as a flexible term. Emotional value is also a bit of a flexible term too. So if both of these things are hard to define, somebody may be perfectly fine with the 25% and be like, yeah, well, take my crappy house. Some people there's no amount of money. It doesn't matter. Like my ancestors are buried here or whatever. So I guess is a better proposal not to just maybe remove eminent domain entirely? I mean, if we're moving from one flexible term of just to another flexible term of emotional value, how are we really solving that problem?
Just to make sure I understand your question, why not get rid of eminent domain altogether?
I mean, did you even consider that when you're looking into this thesis? And then the second follow-up to that is, are we just not trading one loose term for another loose term?
Right. So to answer your first question, the thought did occur to me, but eminent domain is not all bad. We wouldn't be where we are today without eminent domain. We wouldn't have half the highways and the roads we travel to go see our loved ones on Thanksgiving without eminent domain. As I stated earlier in my thesis, that my proposal was not an argument against eminent domain for public uses or even for private development. It's just that when people's homes are being taken, they are being paid less and taken advantage of, and so they should be fairly compensated. So for your second question, just to make sure I clarify, would this additional 25% not?
Are we just trading one vague term for another?
I don't believe so. When I first looked into this thesis and what I could do to help reform it, I looked into redefining blight even and public use, but those are real subjective definitions. And many people have tried to define blight, but again, according to Merriam-Webster's, the definition of blight is harmful or hazardous to human health. Well, even that's so subjective that you can go back and forth with different people on it. And so I truly think that going the route of redefining just compensation is not trading loose ends for another, but the true way to kind of begin to reform the abuse of eminent domain.
And then just to follow up on to finish this line of questioning, is there any other precedent, and this is maybe a little bit beyond the scope, but is there any other industries or fields where something like an emotional value gets attached to a business deal or a purchase agreement that you came across as maybe a model for applying this to eminent domain?
So before I found the 25% value added by Missouri and the other 5 states, I found it in the medical field that when you get in a car accident or a motorcycle crash, I'm not sure to the extent of what it extends to, but you are awarded some amount of money for the trauma and the loss that you suffer. Again, I'm not too sure on the facts that pertain to it, but there are examples in other fields that are awarded compensation for these kind of effects.
Christy.
Okay, I wanted to follow up on Mr. Donaldson's line of questioning on the loose terms and get into that basis that you used for that 25%, just a tiny bit more than you did in your thesis, because you said you based it on Missouri. Did they do, when you looked at that, did they do a good job of making that term, did they make good arguments for it? What were the arguments they made for 25%? Why 25%?
I I'm not exactly sure to the extent of why they proposed a 25%, but I do know that it has, worked for Missouri. People are being, compensated more fairly than they were before, and it didn't reduce the economic development projects or economic growth even. So it is working for Missouri. I'm not 100% sure where they came up with a 25% number. My guess would be maybe it's just a fourth of the fair market value. That sounds pretty reasonable. Let's go with that. That's kind of my train of thought, but I'm not 100% sure where they kind of came up with the idea for 25%.
Sonny.
So I'm curious how you would address damages, compensation for damages on non-seized property, such as a pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Locally we're dealing with that issue now. And I was in a meeting the other day where the subject came up about restoration, and it was mentioned that they were going to remove some 300-year-old oak trees
Mm-hmm.
To put in their pipeline, and how would they compensate for that? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yes, sir. So if a pipeline is, say, being put on your property and going through, and it causes damage or harm to Miss Wilson's, 300-year-old oak trees, what would happen with that is what you're asking? Just make sure I'm understanding.
Or your oak trees on
Right.
your property?
So, yes, sir. So in that case, they would take the sliver or the piece of land that was damaged or affected by this pipeline or whatever project is coming in. They would take the fair market value of that little sliver or piece of property, and since it technically is that person's home or land, they would be qualifying for the homestead or heritage value determined on the circumstances of the property. And so they would add that value onto the fair market value for that sliver.
So I know that sometimes when, I'll give you an example. So my in-laws, they live in a neighborhood and they have a natural gas line that was put in, not on their property, but in the neighborhood. And they get a small monetary amount in the month, every month from the company for having this kind of ugly thing in the neighborhood. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's technically under their property. Not entirely sure. They get a check. Sounds pretty awesome. But have you looked into a fair value, not just being a lump sum 25%, but giving the people who were being moved some kind of stake, albeit small but continual, some kind of stake in the business or in the profitable factory that's coming in, so that they now are tiny but part owners, and they're sort of tied financially to this.
Mm-hmm.
Did anything like that come up in your looking at this idea of a just compensation?
Unfortunately, I didn't find anything where they gave them a stake in the the business or anything like that. But if the private development companies want to do that, that's great. I would, that'd be nice to have a little bit of a business, right? But I didn't find anything regarding that. But if they are willing to offer that piece of the business to that person, then, of course, it won't make up for the loss that person has experienced, whether it be, monetary or physical or psychological depravity. But at least it may help their case a little bit. They probably still won't be liked very much by that homeowner, but it may help their case a little bit.
So we know eminent domain is a constitutional issue, but it's also a property issue, which is typically the realm of the state governments. So it sounds like quite a few states have already kind of taken the lead and said, okay, we're gonna make sure there's compensation there. Why not just let the states continue to take the lead? Why do we need something changed at the federal level? Well,
It's not really working how it is right now. And so by adding this additional value, I truly do believe that it would help on the state and government, on the local government, their side of the fight, I guess you could say. I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. Can you tell me your question one more time?
Yeah, sorry. I guess I'm just asking, if, because our laws are set up where federal has a certain authority over certain laws and states retain authority over certain laws, and property is one of those things that the states retain. even though this is a constitutional issue, the effect is on property. So why not just let the states continue the way they've already started, sort of how it affects their citizens and the property in their state, and just kind of leave the federal law alone,
Right.
and just let the states decide what's best for their individual states.
So I agree with you. This is a state's matter. And so, again, as I mentioned, the heritage value would be determined by the states, because in Missouri, for example, 50 years, they get the heritage value. Well, what if it's been 48 years in this other state? Do they not qualify for that? So that's why I kind of left it to be determined by the states. It would have to be first set and become a law in the courts in order for the states to be granted all of that power, if that will. So like Kelo took her case to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that seizing private property from one party and transferring it to another was constitutional. That kind of transaction or that occurrence would have to happen again with my proposal in order for these states to be able to define what they want the heritage and homestead value to be.
All right, that is 30 seconds left, so I'm going to call it there. Thank you, Caleb.